Daniel, thank you so much for your introduction and for your invitation. Thank you, Giuseppe, and anyone else that was responsible for the honor of being here and meeting you all. I've gotten to, there were, of course, some people I knew already, but I've gotten to know some new faces, and I'd love to meet more before I leave. Hopefully you will be friendly and come and say hello, so I can actually feel that I've met a new crowd from Great Britain. It is a real pleasure to see this conference emerge. I know there were a few peripheral groups that were perhaps in opposition to this topic, but none of them, of course, are here right now, I hope. What I want to share with you is, and I'm going to start, you'll forgive me, I usually like to speak extemporaneously, and I probably could now, and if I had to do it over, I would. But you'll see me in the questions, I usually have enough to say. But I'm going to read, I've scripted myself, assuming that after that heavy lunch and all of these papers I've heard up to now, I'm exhausted. And I just sort of began writing down some notes, and then it just took off, and I had a paper, so I figured I might as well use it. It's here. So you'll forgive me for reading it, but the advantage of that, of course, is that it's finite, it's limited, it's not a long paper, and therefore, if you would like, we have more time for questions, comments, and I can also learn from you. So let me begin, and I will probably interject as I read, but let's see how it goes. So let me start on a lighter note. As soon as the call for papers went out, I received an email from Felix Posen. Some of you may know who he is. My friend and well-known advocate for secular Judaism. We are good friends because I never took a penny from him. He did have me for dinner, though, in England a couple of months ago. But other than eating his food, I'd never taken a penny. So sharing his excitement. You have one advocate, you see, over the topic of this conference. For him, Jewish studies was coming into its own by fully embracing such provocative questions as that of atheism, skepticism, and the challenge to monotheism. So he loved it. I told him I was not responsible, but acknowledged that with the maturation of Jewish studies, any subject such as these was worthy of investigation, including those that might have been considered taboo not long ago and now are the subject of this conference. So I wanted to bring you his greetings, whether he wanted me to pass them on or not. I do not intend to dwell on the entire cluster of issues, as Daniel has mentioned, in my specific talk, but I can't help but say a word about each. Maybe I might even modify this as I go on, because I've listened to so many papers, including the justification of the question of skepticism elegantly presented by Giuseppe earlier today. Atheism is a relatively non-issue for me in the pre-modern world, and I'm sure some of you would object, particularly if you're giving papers on pre-modern atheism. Considered uncivilized and savage, out of the pale of the normative. But it might be useful for Jewish historians to consider the work of Alan Kors. I don't know if anyone knows his work. He happens to be a colleague of mine at the University of Pennsylvania, who creatively argued several decades ago that attacks on the existence of God were generated above all by the vitality and controversies of Orthodox theistic culture itself. He showed that Orthodox teachers and apologists in 17th century France were obliged by the logic of their philosophical and pedagogic systems to create many models of speculative atheism for heuristic purposes. Competing theologians refuted each other's proofs of God and depicted the ideas of their theological opponents as atheistic. Capturing the attention of the reading public, theological debate provided intellectual grounds for the disbelief of the first generation of atheistic thinkers. If atheism was in fact the creation of Orthodox Catholic theologians, might we argue similarly that atheism in Jewish circles, or more broadly heresy in general, is constructed by Orthodox arguments, as exemplified by the so-called Sabbatean heresy, which emerged in the mind of a beleaguered 18th century rabbinate defending what they called emunat chachamim, the faith of the wise, of the sages, or the faith in the sages, as Shalom Rosenberg and Yossi Kaplan pointed out in two very important articles on this subject. Skepticism, on the other hand, is more in the norm of Jewish belief, if combined especially with fideism. And after listening to all of the examples that Giuseppe gave, I would have even strengthened this paragraph that I'm going to read right now. In the early modern era, it becomes a major strategy of accepting scientific truths from the Maharal on, distinguishing between realms of divine and natural, legitimating knowledge of the natural world known from human empiricism, while adopting a strong skeptical stance towards knowing the metaphysical, that which is beyond human experience. For some Kabbalists, such as Azariah Figo, Sar Shalom Basilia, or the Ramchal, natural philosophy and Kabbalah could thus be conjoined. Such a position usually emerged independently of classical sources of skepticism, with few noteworthy Italian examples, especially, of course, Simone Luzzatto, most recently studied by Giuseppe Veltri. He is the most explicit and absorbing skeptical thought from classical sources and is indeed exceptional. But I want to spend the rest of my talk, I just had to get in a word or two about the others, on another issue connected to the subject of this conference: the challenge of the exclusive status of monotheism within Judaism. This is related to the question, can Christians or Muslims be monotheists, or do Jews possess a unique hold on the concept? How unique, or is it universally shared? How unique is Sinai, or is it universally shared by other faiths? This, in turn, is directly linked to the ontological status of the non-Jew in Jewish thought. I could easily begin with several medieval formulations of the issue, and I'm sure those of you who are medievalists would prefer that I did, especially that of Maimonides, Hameiri, and others. But I have chosen instead to begin this conversation at a critical moment in the history of Western thought during the Renaissance period. I refer specifically to the challenge offered to contemporary Jews by the Renaissance thinker Pico della Mirandola and his notion of ancient theology, or prisca theologia, the doctrine that asserts that a single true theology exists, which threads through all religions, and which was given by God to humanity in antiquity. Pico, together with his colleague Marsilio Ficino, concluded, on the basis of their rediscovery of ancient pagan and Jewish sources, that a common core of belief exists among all nations and cultures. Pico's formulation of ancient theology posed a unique threat to the continuity of Jewish national existence. He introduced Jews for the first time to the image of a universal cultural experience transcending either Christianity in its present form or Judaism. He argued for a new cultural world in which all separations would be obliterated, and the best of every nation and culture, including Judaism, would be fused into a universal human spirit. With Pico and the Renaissance culture in general, Jews entered for the first time a new dialogue with the Western world. I must attribute that paragraph to a source, to a text I wrote, I bet Giuseppe knows it, in 1987, where I tried to describe Jewish thought in Renaissance culture. And I still follow that text, although some would argue perhaps I've overemphasized Pico's role in this. Certainly, it seems to me it does create a new dialogue. What I meant to say is that during the Middle Ages, the primary debate is between Jews and Christians over the truth of their own faiths. But in this formulation, as you see, the notion of a universal tapestry of all of these cultures, the modern era presents itself in a very different way. Now we are speaking about not simply becoming a Christian. We are becoming part of something. Why you Jews should isolate yourself, ghettoize yourself in your little culture. Come and give us the best of your faith, and we can all share something together. That embrace, that universalism, I would argue, can be located at this very interesting moment, at least in terms of Christian and Jewish thought. In Pico's lifetime and after, several Jewish thinkers noticed this novel formulation and felt the need to embrace it, or to polemicize with it, or to temper the not undisguised Christian appropriation of other religious cultures under the alleged banner of universal faith. What I want to emphasize here is that although it looks like universalism, it's not exactly universalism. In other words, it is basically a Christian universalism. Ultimately, on the banner of universalism, everyone becomes a new kind of Christian. Not a Jew or a Hindu or a Muslim, but a Christian. I offer briefly three interesting illustrations of the impact of Pico's formulation on Jewish thought. The most well-known is that of Leon Hebreo, which has been mentioned by Giuseppe, among others, Yehuda Abravanel in his Dialogi d'Amore. The work has been studied by many scholars. I will only remark here that Leone appears to accept at face value the notion of ancient theology, upholding a vision of the commonality of all humanity. Leon never denied his Jewish background, but the Dialogi is a work written for all human beings, not Jews alone. He could affirm Judaism while at the same time citing pagan myths and even Christian sources. As for Spinoza after him, who held a copy of Leone's book in his own library, Jewish civilization was most relevant when it transcended its own exclusivity, when it became the province of all human beings and all cultures. An even more explicit example of the impact of ancient theology on Jewish thought is that of another character who was a part of my life years ago, Avraham Yagel, in his Beit Ya'ar HaLevanon, the House of Lebanon. In this text, a reworking of a text found in Agrippa, Yagel writes, "The important sages among the Gentiles, who never saw the lights neither of the Torah nor of worship, prophecy, wonders, and miracles, acknowledge the idea of one God." A remarkable comment for a 16th century Jew from Italy. Listen to what these sages spoke about the Creator. He then proceeds to cite monotheistic passages of Orpheus, Zoroaster, Apuleius, and concludes with the great Hermes and his prayer to God as he wrote it at the end of the first chapter of the Pimander. This prayer, Abraham adds, is close to what is found in the Torah of Moses, if one understands all the details of its statements precisely, without the intrusion of any false thoughts, doubt, or suspicion. Notice that last comment suggests that indeed he knew everyone would not agree with the notion of comparing Hermes with the Torah and assuming that you have more or less an identity of faith in one God. One final example is that of the Italian Jewish thinker of the 17th century. You see why I chose Italy to begin my career and why Giuseppe stays there, because, you know, Italian Jews, if you want to find heresy and exciting historical acrimony, then turn to Italy. The third example is another very complex thinker named Yehuda del Bene. In his work called Kisot Levet David, Del Bene perhaps offers the most authentic expression of the internalization of Catholic attitudes by an Italian Jewish writer proud of his Jewish heritage. He considers his Jewish identity intimately linked to the spiritual and political fate of his Catholic neighbors. Del Bene lived in the 17th century. Kisot Levet David has been studied by a few figures in modern times, Sermonetta, Bonfil, myself a little bit, and others. But it is a work that is rather complex and not easily understood and still deserves more scrutiny. He says he sees their faith, that is the Christian faith, as almost identical with the Jewish one. He sees their mission to the far-off islands, referring again to the missions to the larger New World, as a form of teaching Torah to the world. He views their enemies, especially the Ottoman Turks, as his own. And he's even envious of the way they educate themselves and produce their rich monastic culture. Here is Del Mede on Catholic missionaries spreading the gospel. I quote, "Even if they do not observe the words of the Torah as we do today, nevertheless, they still believe that it is the Torah from heaven that was given at Sinai by Moses. For it was God's holy will to awaken a spirit of men of very good virtues, masters of a language spoken according to the Torah today, who are called Christians, to spread out afar a net to those distant islands and to succeed in their purpose." So Del Bene, for all intensive purposes, is a very good Catholic Jew. In the 18th century, the crisis of Jewish life revolved around the sin of hybridity, or what I have called elsewhere mingled identities, of a dilution and blurring of pure faith by the mingling of elements of Christianity with Judaism and with even Islam. Boundary crossing, not necessarily antinomianism, as Pavel Macheko has recently argued against Gershon Sholem, was the real heresy of the Sabbateans, as well as of lapsed conversos, individual converts, Christian Hebraists, and even former Jews who had become evangelical missionaries. Figures such as Yonatan Eibeshitz, the subject now of Macheko's second biography, or second book, Nehemiah Chayon, Johannes Kemper, also the subject of a dissertation by Pavel's student, Jacob Frank and others, created syncretistic notions of monotheism that undermine the undiluted purity of a true Orthodox Jewish faith. Conversos and individual converts straddle the fence between confessions, while Christian Hebraists, evangelicals, and other Christians infatuated with Judaism erected new edifices of faith, resting on a merger of the two religions. The heresy hunters and the beleaguered rabbinate felt threatened since the clear-cut boundaries separating pure Jewish faith from a polluted Christian had blatantly been breached. I have offered elsewhere numerous examples of this phenomenon of blended faiths and hybrid formulations of Judaism and Christianity in the early modern period. Let me add one more remarkable case here from my most recent work, which takes me into Daniel's age, on missionaries and apostasy in the 19th century. Stanislaw Hoga was a Polish Jew who converted to Catholicism and then evangelical Protestantism in the first half of the 19th century, coming under the influence of the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity amongst the Jews. He began to work for the learned missionary Alexander McCall, who asked him to translate his well-known assault into Hebrew, which was called in Hebrew Nitivot Olam, or the old ways, this extraordinary attack, critique of the Talmud. The book caused a sensation among European Jews and evoked strong rebuttals on the part of several well-known Eastern European maskilim. What is less known about the enigmatic Oga, and there was a very interesting article that was written many years ago by Schneier Lyman of Yeshiva University. But the part I'm adding here is a part that he did not include in his own article about Hoga. What is less known about the enigmatic Hoga was that he apparently later regretted his affiliation with the London Society and their efforts to missionize among Jews. He subsequently published several works in English in which he openly ridiculed their meager efforts to convert his former co-religionists and their ill-conceived position that the halakha of the rabbis should be abrogated. On the contrary, Hoga argued, a Jew like him who believes in Christianity is still a Jew, and that Jew should continue to practice Jewish rituals. The assault on Talmudic law by McCall and his colleagues was simply wrong. Jesus had come to uphold the law and not destroy it, and thus Christian faith and Jewish ritual practice could be meaningfully merged in the modern era. Acknowledging the social status of the Goy went hand in hand with an appreciation and acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the Christian monotheistic faith. Jewish apologetics of the 19th century focus on distinguishing contemporary Christianity from ancient paganism. The distinction only makes sense when the Jew acknowledges that his Christian neighbors have legitimate faith systems as valid as his own, at least for them. Elevating the status of the Goy holds within it the implicit recognition of the validity of his faith, of the recognition that Jews do not have an exclusive claim to monotheism. In this same era, that is the 19th century, one particular group of Jews offered the primary resistance to the notion of blended faiths and religious boundary crossings, insisting instead that only Judaism offered an ideologically pure form of monotheism to the world. They were primarily but not exclusively liberal Jews who had considerably diminished the collective demands of halachic practice in favor of the personal autonomy of one's individual faith. For them, what remained uniquely Jewish was the idea of one God. Jewish monotheism, as they claimed, was even the original faith of Jesus and was later corrupted by the Church Fathers and the Catholic Church. Judaism was admittedly not the only monotheism, but it was the earliest, the most authentic, and the most perfect form that had ever existed in the history of humankind. An entire pantheon of Jewish thinkers, primarily German ones, from the beginning of the 19th century well into the 20th century, justified the existence of the Jewish people in Western civilization as bearers of this unique monotheistic formulation. I need only recall the well-known writings of Emanuel Wolff, Abraham Geiger, Heinrich Gretz, Nachman Krachmel, Hermann Cohn, and of course Leo Beck. The Reformed Jewish ideologues in this group, who had abandoned an unwavering commitment to Jewish ceremonial law, felt especially compelled to argue that Judaism was still unique even without halakha and could be differentiated from Christianity as a result of its singular version of monotheism. They took a stringent polemical stand in favor of the separation of Christianity from the body politic, that is, religion and state, and the need to define a Jewish faith in opposition to a Christian one. This position seems to be argued as well by a group of Maskilim in Eastern Europe. I refer to the less examined writing of Samuel Joseph Fine, F-U-E-N-N, Isaac Bear Levinson, the Ribal, and Eliezer Zwiefel, in their strong defense of the rabbis in the Talmud against Alexander McCall and his missionaries. The original monotheism and who conceived it and protected its purity became a critical concern for them, as well in defining a unique space for Judaism within Western civilization. So these later sentences I've added are all very, very new. I've been working on them for the last couple of months. But what I'm arguing here is that not only is the more well-known position of the liberal thinkers that I mentioned, primarily in Germany, against the idea of blending Jewish monotheism with Christian monotheism, but also in the East there are echoes of the same thing. And these Eastern Maskilim are reading the thinkers of the West. And are influenced by people like Geiger and Frankel, and are incorporating them into their writing. One of the things that seems to me a rather imbalance is that the history of Jewish thought is primarily told from a Western European perspective, and indeed Eastern European thought needs to be looked at, not simply as a political movement of Haskalah, but actually to look at these individuals as thinkers as well. This became especially acute when the missionaries argued that Jews cannot be true monotheists nor fully integrated into European society without giving up on rabbinic theology and practice. The political discourse about which Jews are worthy of emancipation and which are not intertwined with the theological discourse on what is the authentic monotheism and who is the real creator and embodiment of its truth. So you see my survey, I began in the 15th century, and now I'm working my way up to the 20th and 21st, which is rather hazardous for an early modern historian, but I do it anyway. In our own day and age, one for some of post-denominationalism and the call for a spirituality and religiosity that transcends confessional faiths, the old debate about monotheism seems to have faded. Judeo/Christian heritage no longer offends Jewish thinkers, as it once did only a generation ago in Arthur Cohn's powerful polemic against the seemingly hyphenated relationship between the two religions. You recall his very famous book on the myth of the Judeo-Christian tradition. On the contrary, with a new assault on Islam as an alleged incubator of terrorism and radicalism, the blended relationship between Judaism and Christianity appears all the more accentuated. The myth of the Judeo-Christian tradition, as Cohn called it, fails to unsettle many thinkers, Christians or Jews alike. Excuse 1 second. It'd be better if I drink this. Thank you. Instead, we have more or less accepted the notion that there is no authentic or antique form of monotheism, superior to other forms, and that we all share one God and one universal faith. If Judaism is to remain unique, it can no longer claim a superior faith in one God. Instead, it must rely on halakhic commitment, or on ethnic or national ties, or on family nostalgia, or on Holocaust memory. Jews can no longer assume an exclusive claim for the birth and evolution of monotheism. It is no longer the private treasure of the Jewish people. Rather, it is their gift to all humankind and binds them rather than separates them from their fellow human beings. To some contemporary Jews, Pico's idyllic vision of ancient theology appears all the more satisfying, connecting the best of Jewish ideas with Christian ones and justifying a fellowship of merged faith and mingled identities. In this connection, I would like to close my survey with a consideration of the contemporary American Jewish thinker Shaul Magid. Never met the man. I plan to meet him next fall. He's coming to Penn. But I have read some of his writing, and I think it's worth talking about. I don't know how many of you have heard of his work, but I hope, if not, I will introduce you today. Magid is known for his work on Kabbalistic and Hasidic thought, but has in recent years taken up the role of the theologian of post-denominationalism and Jewish revival in the American Jewish community, especially expounding the position of Zalman Schachter Shlomi and Shlomo Carlebach, who has now been elevated from entertainer to theologian, and arguing for their relevance for the era in which we live. Before summarizing his theological stance, I should point out parenthetically that even his most recent historical work, which just came out last year, on the incarnational theology of Hasidism, which he calls it that, points out how Judaism adopted a theology uncannily close to Christianity without even recognizing it as such. So you see that even his Hasidic work is related to the agenda I'm going to discuss right now. Magid, by the way, teaches at Indiana University. Magid opens by reviewing some of the history we have just discussed. His reiteration is useful in contextualizing his novel position in an allegedly novel age. He claims that, and here I'm going to provide some quotes, that in the 19th century, the tendency was to value uniform cultures over heteronomous ones. In religion, that tendency led to a belief in the myth of pure, unadulterated revelatory systems. As a type of hybridity, syncretism was a pejorative term, mostly relegated to Oriental quote-unquote religions that did not make exclusivist claims and were thus considered inferior religions. Modern Jewish thinkers, even the more progressive and historicist ones, tended to present Judaism as a coherent belief system and avoided the notion of syncretism as a phenomenon in the history of Judaism. Quote, in a multicultural world, however, syncretism has taken on a positive valence. Blending is viewed not as defiling, but as enhancing a particular religion. The phenomenologist of religion Gerhard van der Loo has suggested that religions are in constant flux and thus borrowing is a natural part of religion's own dynamism. This is all the quote from Magid. Multiculturalism pushes particularistic societies to abandon their master narratives and theories of uniqueness in favor of an orientation that acknowledges and supports, borrowing from one another while maintaining distinct but not exclusive identities. While historicism may sometimes undermine the mythic construct of uniqueness, it often erects in its place an ostensibly factual historical construct of distinctiveness that is still exclusivist in orientation. In existing Jewish denominations built on the historicist model, Judaism is still by and for Jews, and theories of Jewish chosenness are still defended. In Jewish renewal's syncretistic model, however, Judaism is constructed by Jews, but what Judaism has to offer is not necessarily limited to Jews. The boundaries of Judaism itself have become permeable. As I see it, Magid continues, only in Jewish renewal's syncretistic post-denominational approach does Judaism move in a direction that suggests both an ideological and functional universalism. This non-exclusive particularism frees Judaism to view itself as one of many societies and one of many spiritualities, each of which has a role to play in the order of the world. When Judaism no longer needs to defend its uniqueness theologically or historically, it can more comfortably view itself as a partner in humanity. While it is true that the permeability of boundaries threatens the survival of any distinct community, the multicultural model that promotes an ideology of mutual recognition and respect is a buffer against that danger. In this regard, I think Jewish renewal takes multiculturalism more seriously than other American Jewish alternatives. Its universalism is not only prophetic or messianic utopianism, relegated to a redemptive future, but part of the way Judaism needs to be lived in the here and now, instead of simply assimilating into a pre-existing Americanism as the Reform movement did. Jewish renewal creates a religious framework in dialogue with the other religious currents in America. Instead of offering Judaism as a separate sphere of religious practice, Jewish renewal offers a blending of Judaism with other spiritual practices in order to construct a more complex and sensitive religious alternative that is aligned with American sensibilities garnered from a counterculture now mainstream. You see how American this theology is, quote, unquote. I finished the quotation of Magid. That wasn't my opinion, so don't get mad at me now if you don't like it. And by the way, the book that I'm referring to is about a 500-600-page book on this theology of post-denominationalism. So you can't ignore it. I mean, he does repeat himself, but nevertheless, there's a lot in it. In concluding with Magid's radical formulation of Judaism and its faith in the era in which we live, I do not wish to imply that he is correct, chas v'chalila, that his is the final word, and that his call for post-denominationalism resonates widely among other Jewish thinkers, leaders, and laity. Although I might confess that it certainly reflects to some extent, a reality that is taking place whether we have theologians or not, at least in the United States, and I assume in Great Britain as well. I assume it does not, or at least not yet, is the way I put it. My goal in closing with this contemporary perspective was simply to chart the impact of Pico's theological syncretism on Jewish thought. I'm sure Magid never heard of Pico, or I don't know, maybe he did. But nevertheless, I would like to associate his posture with these positions that emerged in the 15th century, over 5 centuries earlier, and to argue that it was enthusiastically embraced by an interesting group of thinkers throughout the early modern period, but fiercely contested by anti-Sabbatean rabbis in the 18th century and by Reform rabbis in the 19th. Perhaps Magid is right that we live in an age which no longer values uniform cultures or pure, unadulterated revelatory systems. Syncretism and blended identities have become the norm, and Judaism's future is to break down all barriers separating its religious culture from those of other communities, especially Christian ones. But has he sufficiently factored in the hostility of so many to Jews and Judaism in the world we still inhabit, even when Jews seek the universal path he espouses? And has he considered adequately the stubborn persistence of religious and cultural boundary maintenance on the part of many Jews throughout the world, including those living in the North American continent as well? In not claiming any expertise in constructive theology, I will leave it to others to evaluate the cogency of his provocative opinions. I can only state, as a mere historian, that Magid's position has a long pedigree, and that despite the enormous differences between Pico's and our own world, certain continuities remarkably persist. Thank you.